I am no king. I am more fit to be a jester. I was unaware of my own blindness. We are feeble vessels with feebler souls. We would cast aside the prop of life only to face greater hardship.
Alright, welcome back to Honored Madman. I hope everybody's well. We've got a pretty big video for you guys here today. And as the title probably suggests, it's going to be about King Vendrick from Dark Souls 2. So let's just get right into it. So, Vendrick, at the time of Dark Souls 2, when we take control of our character for the first time, he's just the latest in a long line of failed kings of ruined kingdoms, which it seems to be one of the big themes of Dark Souls 2 as a whole, is that, it's all been done before, and no matter how brilliant you build something up, it's always going to crumble in the end. And Dark Souls 2 leans heavily into the cycles nature of the Dark Souls universe, and this is something that was continued by Dark Souls 3, where even more cycles have passed since Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 1. It's a big recurring theme at this point. But in many ways, the story of King Vendrick is the story of Dark Souls 2, or at least it's the backstory of Dark Souls 2. I think Vendrick is unique amongst Dark Souls historical figures, in no small part because we actually get to interact with him, or at least a memory of him. But he's a character who, well, yeah, he's not as iconic as Gwyn. That doesn't make his character story any less interesting. In fact, I'd say that he maybe even has a little bit more depth and nuance, or maybe it's just because his story is more tragic than Gwyn's. But so while Vendrick might not be the god of sunlight and didn't go to war with the ancient dragons, his story is still important to the overall trilogy that is Dark Souls, especially when we look at what came after, Dark Souls 3. But without further ado, this is probably going to be a long one, so let's get right into it. Settle on in, get yourself a snack, something of the like. Alright, so Dark Souls 2 is often described as having a dreamlike quality to it, for good reason if you've played the game. And in many ways, the Kingdom of Dranlek, where the game is set, is the metaphorical and spiritual dream of King Vendrick. It's sort of a monument to all of his accomplishments, and by the time we get to explore it, it's sort of a monument to There we go. Anyway, so in any other game series, a character like Vendrick would be the protagonist that you play as. He's got what people would call main character energy, or at least he did. You could say that Vendrick was cursed with an unshakable determination. I mean, he was born with this unquenching desire and drive for power that sort of guided all of his actions. He grew immensely powerful throughout his conquests and raised a kingdom from the ruins of all of his successful victories. Now, yeah, that sounds pretty cool, but since this is Dark Souls 2, Vendrick's story is actually a lot more of a tragedy, one that may even compel sympathy. He had the wisdom and strength and sheer will to literally forge a great kingdom like Dranlek out of 12 lesser kingdoms and ruins and constituent regions, but he still wasn't able to see what was right in front of him. We'll get to that though. Let's focus more on the man himself for now. So we can look at Vendrick as almost a proto-Godfrey type figure now that we have Elden Ring for context. He started out as a simple warrior with immense strength and an extremely cool older brother named Aldia. While the origins of the two brothers' early life is certainly unknown, we do know a lot about Aldia's life in general. He was like on another level. He was one of those really badass fantasy characters. He bred dragons, pondered the greater secrets of the universe and existence, and he was deeply obsessed with studying the nature of souls. I don't want to get too off topic though. He rocks. I did a whole long ass video on him like a year ago. It's pretty good, but let's keep it moving. So Vendrick was a natural leader. In the beginning, his army started out as what's described as, a simple ragtag band of followers. He was like an Achilles or a Beowulf type figure. Now, because of his own humble origins, Vendrick favored simple warriors who valued strength and determination above all else. His most elite warriors became known as the Dragon Riders. They were a cavalry, except instead of using horses, they rode wyverns. The wyverns were, of course, created by Aldea's research into dragons. These dudes were towers, though. They wore these massive suits of armor and usually wielded these long-reaching melee weapons or these giant great bows. They were highly effective. So Vendrick, along with his brother and this band of brutally efficient warriors, conquered all of the disparate, squabbling lesser kingdoms of the region. Some of these domains, like that of the Old Iron King, had experienced disasters that had opened them up to attack from this prolific warlord Vendrick, and in some cases he really just had to conquer the remnants of a fallen land. In the end, the 12 regions that he conquered became one unified super kingdom called Dranlaek. And from what I could tell, at least in the early days, Vendrick was a pretty chill leader. For example, he allowed the regions that he conquered to keep their religious practices, but allowed no clerics in his own castle or anywhere near him, honestly, and only really allowed representatives for traditional reasons, just to make them feel important. He personally held little value in religious and clerical practices, but he allowed it in Dranlaek. It kept everybody happy. And while he wasn't really interested in miracles or stuff like that, he did occasionally employ some religious organizations like the Archdrake sect over in the Shrine of Amana, unless they're there of their own accord. But yeah, Vendrick didn't mind these people just believing whatever they wanted to believe as long as it didn't really interfere with his rule. Now, as far as Vendrick's standing army went, he placed a great value. They were all given the status and title of royal soldier or swordsman. And as far as kings go, he really went the extra mile as far as making sure his people were properly equipped. After he saw the high-quality steel that was produced in the ruin of the Kingdom of Hyde, he had several of his smiths work tirelessly to reproduce their high-quality steel, only to only really marginally recreate it, not up to the same quality as the ancient smiths of the Flame Tower of Hyde. Still not content with the quality of his army's gear, Vendrick looked to the neighboring kingdoms that were still standing, places like the country of Mira to the east, where Lucatil was from. The kingdom was famous for its swordsmen, magic water, and the constant warfare it was always engaged in. And for a small fortune, Vendrick was able to effectively buy a very prominent smith from Mira named Llewellyn just so that his famous Guy steel could be introduced into Dranlaek. Llewellyn would forever miss his home, but I assume that the vast riches he received from this bargain made the pain at least a tad bit more bearable. And he would honestly go on to produce some really cool stuff for the Kingdom of Dranlaek, like the Royal Dirk or the Espada Ropera, and of course, the very Game of Thrones Night's Watch style set worn by Chancellor Veliger that has these really good stats, at least for its weight, and that's mainly in Dark Souls 2, not so much in Dark Souls 3, but it's still a great set. Now, it's worth noting that the stuff that was forged by Llewellyn was reserved only for Vendrick's inner circle, high-ranking dudes like the Chancellor Veliger, for example. So I guess, in short, Vendrick pulled a Tywin and literally purchased the best foreign smith he could find so he could have the very best shit in all the land. I mean, that's pretty cool. Now, in addition to that, the soldiers in the royal army wore armor inspired by the legendary paladin Leroy, and the swordsmen were given these extremely well-made claymores made up of that almost imitation hide steel. But this was all done to show the immense pride that he had in his forces, and after consolidating his army, Vendrick then sought to build his own palace and, organize his kingdom and all that. His brother Aldea assisted him for a time with things like providing the wyvern mounts for his dragon cavalry and the Looking Glass Knight, this suit of armor that used a mirror shield to summon a squire from another dimension. But soon Aldea became all too consumed with figuring out how to overcome the curse and, deeply infatuated with the nature of the soul of man. And he went about finding the answers he sought through, human experimentation and research and, of course, dissection. Now, originally the two of them were aligned in this. Mainly for Vendrick, it was all about overcoming the eventual curse of the undead. But the two brothers and their own differing methods would cause them to drift apart as the years went by. But that was, down the road. In the early days of Dranlaek, it was a whole different story. Vendrick and Aldea studied the one thing that caused the downfall of just about every previous kingdom that had risen and fallen in their region, the curse of the undead. Through this, Vendrick and his brother would eventually uncover the very nature of the undead curse as it had come to be known, and would be shocked to find out that the hollow was man's truest of forms. In fact, there was a time when everybody was a hollow, a time before souls. They would eventually come to learn that their idea of life outside of being hollow was nothing but an illusion, a prop of life, as Aldea would go on to call it. And this prop was effectively used to get the undead, or in this case, the humans of the world, to do the bidding of some, well, for lack of a better word, gods of antiquity like Gwyn, so that he can continue to exert his influence and control over the world. But it wasn't even only that. See, life, the life that Flame had given the world, was actually pretty cool. There were many reasons that anyone, be it god or human, would have to want to prolong it. It's the only life that they know. I mean, they don't remember the time before the fire. Well, besides Gwyn and his buddies, but for everybody else, this life, this age of fire, what it provided for them is all they've ever known. And for it to die off and turn into nothing but darkness or something new is scary. Change is scary. And because life was so unique and familiar and comfortable for people, Gwyn probably believed that he wouldn't even really have to do much manipulating. I mean, he really didn't. His snake didn't have to do much convincing to get the average undead to go try and sacrifice themselves. While most perished on that journey, the occasional one did make it, and what are they greeted with? The hollow of Lord Gwyn, and of course their very own incineration. It was definitely a strategic move that Gwyn did to go be the first one to relink the flame. He would create a legend for himself. A legend that would be told and followed and carried on long after he had passed and hollowed out completely and existed only as ashes. In fact, as we know, it makes it all the way from Dark Souls 1 to Dark Souls 2 to Dark Souls 3. So his legacy definitely lasted. Yeah, his name was forgotten during Dark Souls 2, but it's remembered again by the events of Dark Souls 3. But the creation of this legend, this mythos, was key to prolonging the Age of Fire indefinitely, at least as Gwyn saw it. Aldea, the scholar of the First Sin himself, admits the brilliance of this scheme of the gods and of the very illusion of life. He refers to it as well as brilliant and goes on to mention how spectacularly unpredictable that it could be by mentioning Vendrick, the man who lost his head but continued on, the ones who pursue charms of love, all these things that the supposed illusion of life had provided with humanity and even the gods. The illusion provides warmth to man, who before that was in the dark and only ever really knew darkness. But the most important thing that it did was that it got mankind to rely on its comforts and struggles and this whole sense of existence and self that it gave them. That way, when the flame began to fade and the illusion of life that they cherished began to crumble, the average human would be more than willing to be sacrificed to prolong the greater illusion of life by linking this flame. Almost like a tradition, like they're following Gwyn's example, as the flame tended to fade each cycle, and even though the flame stifled their very existence, man was more than willing to sacrifice their body and mind to continue it. When the flame fades and man starts showing signs of what it truly is, hollows, it was dubbed the Curse of the Undead, but all it showed was the weakening of the flame, and by extension the weakening of the illusion of life, that, like Aldea says, a lie, no matter how brilliant or beautiful, is still a lie, still an illusion. And our hollowing is proof of that. But like I said, things are never really that simple. I mean, men viewed the hollowing as bad because they loved the illusion of life and the fire and all of that stuff. They loved it all. They didn't want to forget who they were and go into this existence as a walking, mindless, rotting zombie, which was how they viewed it. Men would do anything to continue living in the dream that the Age of Fire provided for them. And that's exactly what these gods wanted, hence calling it a curse and the branding of humanity with the dark sign. This was all orchestrated by the infamous Lord of Light, Gwyn, and his followers like Frampt, the World Serpent. And Aldea is right, it is a brilliant manipulation because it ensured that the fire kept being linked endlessly until the events of Dark Souls 3, where it can in fact be linked again. And since Gwyn and his buddies are the gods, they get to rewrite history and tell whatever story they want to the humans. It's not something we haven't seen before. It actually reminds me a bit of the Tribunal from Morrowind, if you're familiar with a little bit of Elder Scrolls lore. They essentially stole divinity and paraded themselves around as gods for centuries until they were stopped, sort of, in the events of Morrowind. And they aren't even the main antagonist. The main antagonist is a pretty cool guy, but I'm getting off topic here. Anyways. And I don't know if Aldi or Vendrick ever learned it, but Gwyn would go on to sacrifice everything to prolong his age of fire. But I'm getting ahead of myself. How did they figure all this info out? They likely had to piece together a rough account of events from whatever small little bits of information survived the Age of the Gods and the Age of Dark Souls 1. And of course the newer kingdoms that would rise from the ashes of Dark Souls 1's events but be ruins by the time of Dark Souls 2's. So I think that's the most likely explanation on how they got their knowledge is, to put it simply, ruins. And there certainly was no shortage of ruins of past civilizations in the area for them to explore and, peruse. So I'd imagine records of one of these kingdoms' plague of undead survived the passage of time, but both brothers knew that even if they built the most perfect, unassailable, unbreakable kingdom, that before long the curse would reveal itself and the great kingdom of Dranlake would go the way of all the others that came before it. They really didn't want to look at all these ruins of past civilizations as the future of the kingdom that they were building up. And again, they both would go about finding ways to overcome this curse in different ways. I got a whole video talking about how Aldia did it, but Vendrick, on the other hand, he had different methods. He sought the strength of past kings and monarchs for his answers. And let's just say that the brothers' results from their respective tests would vary rather greatly. Vendrick could create a salve for one individual, and Aldia's dragon-human hybrids only produced one true success, and even that was deemed a failure and would only serve as a guide ultimately. So in shorter, less confusing words, they both were ultimately unsuccessful. But we'll get to that. We're getting ahead of ourselves here. So one day, back in Dranlake's fledgling years, a stranger arrived on Vendrick's doorstep. And it wasn't just anybody either. It was a hot blonde from a faraway place. She had an accent. He wasn't really sure what to make of her at first, a refugee perhaps, come to warn this strong warrior king of the looming threat to the north. And what could that threat possibly be? Well, I imagine Vendrick was surprised to know it was the giants. Who knows if anybody in the continent that Dranlake's at had even seen a giant before this, let alone know they exist. But for some reason, Vendrick himself probably couldn't even explain. He was compelled to trust this woman. And, ultimately, who could blame him? Look at this really cool, rare concept art of the two of them. Just a really cool image. Anyway, for whatever reason, she seemed to have it out for the giants. But, her name was Nashandra, and she had, let's just call them, curious origins. So, if you ever wondered what happened to Manus after he was quote-unquote slain at the end of Dark Souls 1's DLC, Artorias of the Abyss, then look no further. We've got your answer, but we are going to get sidetracked for a second explaining the nature of Nashandra. This is also mainly just to show the existential nature of the forces that Vendrick was up against and that were, in a sense, conspiring against him, or not even really conspiring, they were just up against him. So way back in the days of the Dark Souls 1 prologue cutscene, back when dragons ruled the surface and all the other people were forced to live underground, during this age, or what is often referred to as the beginning, the regular people were more or less the same. They were just these hollow-like guys who walked around in the darkness. That is, until a handful of them stumbled on the first flame. And obviously this monumental discovery would change everything. Not only did it add all these new concepts to the world, this sort of struggle, if you will, between hot and cold, light and dark, it created both of those concepts. Before that, there was no disparity between the two. But all that stuff wouldn't become obvious until much later. For now, what was important was what was inside the first flame. A handful of very powerful souls. Gwyn and a few of his buddies found Lord Souls. Now, these souls weren't like any other of the lesser souls that we may be familiar with. These ones were ridiculously powerful and gave them all godlike abilities or potential to have godlike abilities. Now, another individual, one of these people who lived under the surface, they were humanity's ancestor. They were known as the Furtive Pygmy. You might have heard of them, but they're said to be pretty easily forgotten, which it turns out is by design, but we'll we'll get to that. So, humanity's ancestor, the furtive pygmy, they found a different but equally powerful soul called the Dark Soul. Now, this one was unique amongst the other Grey Souls due to its ability to fragment amongst the pygmy's descendants without losing any of its overall power or size. It could essentially replicate itself. Now, naturally, Gwyn feared this potential, but it didn't stop him from enlisting the ancient humans known as the Pygmies in his fights against the dragons. I mean, how could he pass the opportunity up? Yeah, it was the problem he would have to deal with in the long run, but as it stood, he needed their numbers to fight the dragons. But he wasn't going to allow them any of the glory, at least in the outside world. So, following the allied victory against the dragons, Gwyn managed to convince the Pygmies to become subservient to him, but he did grant them this glorious city at the edge of the world, and he even gave them one of his own heavenly daughters. Must have been pretty enticing for the Pygmy Lords because they were completely fine with this, and since Gwyn had built them this great city where no one would ever visit, they were going to be effectively out of sight and out of mind for all eternity. But that wasn't enough for Gwyn. He knew that the problem that humanity represented wouldn't just go away if he tucked them all in a little city at the edge of the world. He knew that their numbers would eventually swell and they'd be all over the rest of the world too. So secretly he used the magic of the first flame to place a brand on the dark soul of man, which appeared in all humans eventually as they all inherited the dark soul from their prime ancestor, the first pygmy. Now this brand weakened the concept of humanity, so the individual humans were affected by it, obviously, and it caused man as a whole to assume a fleeting form when by all rights they should be as ageless as the gods. This whole existential struggle between light and dark was really born the exact minute that fire was discovered underground by Gwyn and his buddies. Fire, by its very nature, creates both light and dark. For as much light as fire provided, there was always going to be darkness outside of its reach. And that darkness, to Gwyn and the gods, was the unknown, the domain of the humans and pygmies. But as the flame faded, the light it provided would diminish, and that darkness outside of its reach would grow to the point where one day it would be at the gods' very doorstep. And you can imagine what that crushing realization would be like for somebody like Gwyn. The gods got all their strength and abilities from the light that flame provided, and it evened the score for them against the everlasting dragons. Gwyn built a whole empire around the light that the flame provided, even calling himself the Lord of Sunlight, but of course he couldn't bear the idea of the darkness outside of the flames, one day reaching his lands. Lands that were previously illuminated by the very fire that he had revered so much and gotten his power from. Which, when you think about it, maybe his fear was justified. I mean, he got everything from the light of the flame, and now it was all going to be taken away from him and be in the hands of these humans who, at the end of the day, he just fundamentally did not understand. Gwyn's immense fear of humans only grew the more he thought about their potential to overthrow him just based on their sheer numbers and how rapidly they reproduced compared to his own godkin race. But for all his meddling, he inevitably sowed his own poison by not knowing when to let go of something. See, Gwyn really didn't want to stop being god of everything when his time was up, so he artificially extended the Age of Fire at the cost of his own sanity and senses. He hollowed out, which was essentially his greatest fear. He really didn't want humanity to win, so much so that he literally killed himself to give his offspring and advisors more time to figure out a solution to the humanity problem. Which they sorta did eventually. Kingseeker Frampt and Gwyn's descendants put a system in place so that the humans, who there was plenty of, could solve this problem for them willingly and at their own expense to keep these gods in power, and of course humanity in shackles. Shackles that most humans weren't even aware of. And this was the system that Vendrick was up against. Even if it was all a forgotten ruin by the time he was born, humanity still had to deal with the consequences of all of this. The curse still existed and still affected humanity. It didn't matter if Gwyn was long gone or not. The pygmies he kept buried in the darkness would eventually wake up and they wouldn't be too happy about it, so to speak. I mean, the Dark Souls 1 DLC goes to show you that you can't just keep a problem out of sight and out of mind. It's not going to just solve itself unless you have a time-traveling undead. Eventually, someone's going to have to deal with the Abyss. And the only reason that is because Gwyn chose to suppress humanity as a whole. Alright, hopefully that was somewhat, understandable. I'm not sure how good I did at reiterating those events, but I tried to do it fast. Anyways, though, back to Nishandra. How about that? A tangent within a tangent. So, long story short, this lovely lady came into existence when a time-traveling undead killed a rampaging gigantic pygmy lord named Manus. See, for a long time, Manus slept in the abyss. And outside of his pygmy nature, we actually don't know much about who or what Manus was. According to Vendrick, Manus was sort of like the abyss personified. But originally, I think he was just a regular human or a pygmy that grew to this massive mutated form after slumbering in the abyss for presumably most of the Age of Fire. You know, nothing is particularly clear, but it's a safe guess. And look at him, it's a great demonstration of the true power of humanity and the Dark Soul itself. If nothing else, it sort of justifies Gwyn's fears of the dark. I mean, when you look upon Manus and the monster that he's become. But it's important to remember that Manus is only this way because he's been suppressed, you know, by Gwyn and the other gods of Anor Londo. Some people have even theorized that Manus and the mysterious furtive pygmy might actually be one and the same. I don't think that's the case, but ultimately it doesn't really matter, since by its very nature the Dark Soul doesn't lose any of its power as it fragments to the pygmy's descendants. So it could be, you know, he could be the furtive pygmy, or he could just be the furtive pygmy's great-grandson. It's really tough to say. Whether it's him or just some other ancient pygmy is, you know, it's not something we'll ever have a clear answer for, to my knowledge. Much of his old personality presumably is gone, and the only thing left is just unchecked, powerful humanity that's in a form of rage because it lost that doll, and was, of course, woken up from his long hibernation. But like I was saying, we know very little about who Manus was before he became the monster of primeval man. We don't know if he was a veteran of the wars against the dragons with the other pygmies and humans, but for whatever reason he wound up slumbering in the abyss for presumably a very long time until he was woken up by the residents of a golden kingdom known as Ulasil. And these callous individuals either stole or misplaced his doll, which itself would wind up all the way in the Grand Archive of an insane scaleless duke in Anor Londo, the very city of the gods, but that's a whole other story as to how that got there. Now, according to the blind giant Goth and a time traveler from Bloodborne named Chester, the people of Ulasil were encouraged by a toothy serpent. Wonder who that could be. But they were encouraged to investigate the chasm to the abyss that had opened up beneath Ulasil. And yes, obviously the snake in question was probably Koth, but it ultimately didn't matter who the individual serpent was, because the damage was already done. The kingdom of Ulasil began to fall into the abyss until, according to one legend, a solitary knight capable of striding the abyss through use of his magic ring and his trusty dog managed to stop the abyss threat and defeat Manus. You know, saving Ulasil in the process, but here's the thing. Talk to the Cheshire Cat in Darkroot Gardens, which is the present-day site of Ulasil's ruins, and this cat remembers the unofficial version.
'Tis but a fairy tale.
So yeah, the story of the knight Artorias saving the land and triumphing over the abyss is quite literally a tall tale. It didn't happen. It's a fabrication. And this makes sense for a couple reasons. For one, the gods wouldn't have had to have flooded New Londo after the inhabitants and the four kings discovered the life drain if they could have just sent Artie to go settle up with them. If he really could stride the abyss like the legends claimed. The truth of the matter was that Artorias was only able to stride the abyss because he had cut a Faustian bargain, a deal with the devil of sorts, with the monsters of the abyss. He made some sort of pact with them, and this covenant produced the ring that he used to walk the abyss, but it also cursed his greatsword. So he was capable of walking through the abyss, but only to a certain extent, as he was never able to reach the four kings of New Londo and eliminate the abyss threat coming from below, resulting in the ultimate flooding of that city and the loss of all of its culture. It's no surprise that he ran into similar problems here in Ulasil, as presumably the abyss was even stronger here. I mean, this was humanity gone wild and savage and berserk. Far more destructive than the Dark Race or the Kings of New Londo. An easy win, or even any win, was never in the cards for him once he set foot in Ulasil, and he most certainly knew it deep down. A classic fairy tale this was not. what did actually happen was a whole lot less glorious and definitely not a victory for this poor old knight. And look, sure, this story had all the ingredients that a fairy tale would have, but much like the story of Nishandra and Vendrick, it's a complete subversion of the classic heroic tall tale trope, which I think is something I also saw the Orville do. Maybe I should go back and rewatch that show. That shit rocked. Anyway, back to how this actually went down. So, when the people of Ulasil dug too deep, so to speak, and awoke Manus, it did get the attention of the gods. The Lord of Light, Gwyn, sent down 3 of his most legendary and powerful knights to solve the issue. There was the giant archer Goff, who I already mentioned. There was the assassin Ciaran, and of course Artorias himself, who had also brought along his pet dog Sif. So when they touched down in Ulasil, Artorias used his ring to stride through the abyss and do battle with its inhabitants, but he soon became overwhelmed, something that also put his dog's life in danger. So after a bit of quick thinking, he sacrificed his great shield to create an unbreakable protection barrier for Sif, and then presumably he attempted to go challenge Manus, who proceeded to break Artorias by, squeezing him like a bug. Like when that little kid from the Last of Us show got smashed in Game of Thrones. What a horrifically bad season that was. It's obligatory at this point, I have to mention it. Anyway, Manus quite literally broke Artorias and drove him insane. The poor bastard emerged from the chasm corrupted but still retaining some sense of self and began slaying the mutated residents of Ulasil, who by this point had changed into some type of Bloodbornean-style nutball head guys. And yeah, Artorias pretty much just did this until an undead stumbled on Manus' doll and got pulled into the past by primeval man himself. And from there, some storybook hijinks and shenanigans ensued. The undead was guided by a literal mushroom to save a princess that Manus had seemingly mistaken for his doll. It's sort of like a obscure reference to Donkey Kong, with Manus, of course, being Kong. And on their way to go do this, the undead was urged to put down the deranged Artorias, and really they didn't have much of a choice since he kind of blocked the way into the Ulasil township. But the undead, of course, was forced to fight a mercy boss fight against Artorias and win. So yeah, the truth is a lot less pretty than the fairy tale. But anyway, after that, the undead went down into the chasm and did everything that Artorias would become famous for, and, Manus was slain, but he was actually just shattered into several pieces, each one a fragment of his very self. And this was mainly because, Manus, he had a giant dark soul, and the dark soul can't really be destroyed. It sort of just fragments off into its descendants, and in this same way, that's what happened with Manus. It's why Gwyn was so afraid of the Dark Soul, because he saw that each human, as they reproduced, the Dark Soul was in all of them, and it was just as strong as it was originally. It didn't really weaken. It grew in power. And that's kind of what happened here with Manus. We destroyed him only for, who knows how many more Manuses to potentially have the ability to show up and cause problems. But to put it plainly, the reason that Manus was shattered into these individual pieces that then became sentient is because of the nature of the Dark Soul. When Manus was shattered, all of those pieces became new, independent life forms, each one representing a different piece of Manus, and from there they just sort of evolve into the forms we see them in. Anyway, though, these shards of Manus would all be female for some reason, curiously. And perhaps this is some sort of reflection of the Princess Dusk that he kidnapped right before he died. It's really anyone's guess. Curiously enough, most of the known daughters of the Abyss, as they came to be called, would all attach themselves to powerful kings and warlords. There were many such cases. Nadalia of Broom Tower, who showed up all too late but bound herself to the land in a futile attempt to keep it alive for the return of the old Iron King, who himself had been taken over by Icarus Earth. It's a whole story. There was also my personal favorite, the Oracle Alsana of Ilim Lois, who could be considered an antithesis to Nishandra in that she truly cared for the Ivory King and carried out his wishes when he descended into the old chaos for that final time, and she essentially ruled in his stead after that. And I think that's pretty admirable, especially for a so-called child of darkness. Others weren't so lucky though. There's extreme circumstances like with Ilana, who found herself deep underground in the Sunken Kingdom, where she would sort of just attach herself to a powerful slumbering dragon named Sin. And he was no joke. He'd already done battle with a whole troop of Drakeblood knights and emerged victorious, so they weren't really a duo to be messed with. There were also more obscure Children of Darkness like Carla and presumably Zoli as well, but Carla would end up imprisoned in Irithyll Dungeon for the very crime of her existence, Poor girl. Yeah, she refers to herself as depraved and like this evil monster, but we never really see her do anything of the sort. She seems just like a chill homie to keep at the Firelink Shrine. The fact that she's a child of darkness makes it even cooler because it's like subtle Dark Souls 2 reference. Or maybe it's just a localization thing. You guys will have to tell me in the comments. But anyway, we're not focusing on any of those other shards of manus today. We are focusing solely on Nashandra, since, she's so central to Vendrick's story and his character. Essentially, she's the main antagonist of the game, and the whole reason why Vendrick did some of the more questionable things that he did. Well, maybe besides his own desperation due to how bad things got towards the end, but we'll get to that. So Nashandra grew from the personified sense of desire of manus, which is why she is the way she is. I mean, it's not really an excuse because we know that the shards can evolve and change their base nature, as we saw with the Oracle Alsana, who was born of Manus' fear. Now, obviously, the circumstances and the individuals involved in these perspective situations are way different from one another, so all it really shows is that you can't judge a shard of manus by its cover. But I bring it up because we do know that they can change. Even Alsana describes it herself, how she initially only sought out the Ivory King for protection and didn't really care for him at all in the beginning, but she grew to actually love him and honor him and literally carried out his final decree and held the city strong against the oncoming chaos, even when she was the last one standing. And then there's also Carla from Dark Souls 3, so again, we know that not all of the shards of manus are sinister. But anyway, back to Vendrick for now. I just wanted to do a brief recap on Nashandra and the Children of the Abyss. So, the up-and-coming monarch grew to care for Nashandra, who was, as we just discussed, a tiny shred of darkness personified. This particular piece of manus sprouted from his sense of desire and want, and unsurprisingly, Nashandra would compel Vendrick to bring war to the giants by appealing to his own desires for power and, of course, fire.
There they are, Albert. Faces of stone.
Yeah, they've got these crazy stone asshole faces. It's certainly an inspired bit of art direction, if you ask me. The game developers actually went through at least 2 other designs before they settled on this one. I think they made the right aesthetic choice, but you can actually see one of their previous designs in the game right here. Anyway, though, Nashandra referred to the giants as the looming threat in the north and eventually managed to convince Vendrick that they were a big enough threat that they couldn't be left alone, even if all they were known to do was to keep to themselves on their isolated continent in the north and basically leave everybody else alone. Nope, these giants were a threat. Although it's worth noting that Vendrick had that whole unquenchable thirst for fire and power going, so it probably didn't take much convincing to get him to go to war with the giants, and maybe even Nashandra played up to that maybe he'd find fire if he brought war to the giants. But like I already said, she probably didn't even need to do all that anyway. I mean, Vendrick freely admits that by that point he had come to genuinely care for Nashandra in spite of what she was, so it's not surprising that this conquest happened. I mean, he wanted it, she wanted it, they all wanted it, really. There was at this point no stopping it. The invasion of the giants' homeland was scheduled, so Vendrick got the gang back together and took a long boat ride in order to bring his trademark brand of war and ruin to the giants. And bring it he did. It was said that Vendrick and Nashandra fought side by side during this initial invasion and claimed the souls of countless giants as their prize. Now that wasn't all, because Vendrick must have figured that Aldia could learn a thing or two from the unique physiology of the giants, who were made of rock and earth, and perhaps they could provide the answers that had so far eluded him, in his pondering of the nature of the soul. And he did find some answers, but it was only after the brutal experimentation and the resulting dissection of countless giants. Plus, it only really encouraged Aldea's obsessions and his other negative tendencies, but it did have some actual results. I mean, take a look at the ancient dragon. All it took was some dragon bones, a giant soul, and probably the lives of countless hollows. Anyway, though, upon returning to Dranleg following their successful campaign against the giants, Vendrick or Aldea or Nishandra or all three of them created the golems with the giant souls. The golems were used in warfare to build things quickly because they were these, automatons that were controlled by giant souls that presumably obeyed and did whatever Vendrick said. So Vendrick then commanded the golems to first construct a massive elaborate palace for Nishandra, which of course still stands to this day, and then he used them to construct various other structures, bridges, walls, fortresses, and of course, reinforce existing structures. And for what it's worth, Vendrick wasn't greedy with his invention. For example, he sent out aid in the form of a troop of golems to the Ivory King when the chaos began to encroach on Ilium Lois. Vendrick might not have had to deal with the chaos, but he did understand existential threats like that. And these golems can still be found there to this day, and unlike the ones in Dranleg Palace, they can actually be fought. But anyway, on to the real meat and potatoes of this story. Vendrick discovered the Throne of Want deep underground and chose to build his massive towering palace above it. Now, the Throne of Want was essentially the current manifestation of the First Flame itself. The kiln of the First Flame from Dark Souls 1 and 3. But curiously, for whatever reason, Vendrick chose to never once sit the Throne of Want. He never linked the flame. And presumably because of that, it was around this point that Dranleg entered a brief period of peace that some would refer to as having a tinge of darkness to it. And, this was only a peaceful time if you were lucky enough to not wake up in Aldea's mad science lab only to be used as some sort of human battery to an abomination. Anyway, at this point it was said that the kingdom settled into a very quiet darkness, and all Nishandra really had to do was wait. Let the hollowing run its course. Eventually it would claim Vendrick and everyone else, and she would be able to assume her mantle, I guess, as Queen of Darkness. And again, this was rather easy for her because the only two people capable of stopping her were preoccupied with other things. Both Vendrick and his brother pursued increasingly at odds means of overcoming the curse of the undead, as it had suddenly begun to pop up in their land. Although unfortunately the differences in their methods would lead to a falling out between the two of them. This culminated in Vendrick imprisoning Aldea within his own keep, where the world could be kept safe from his relentlessly unethical experimentations, and of course the horrors that they produced. Although the results of that have probably been less than what Vendrick would have hoped for, considering that countless of Aldea's abominations have made it out into the world, and even Aldea himself would eventually find a way to move in between his keep and the rest of the world. But that was ultimately the least of Vendrick's worries at this particular moment. The sins of his past had finally come back to haunt him in the form of the giants' retaliatory invasion of Dranleg. They were of course seeking revenge and presumably damage for the ruin that Vendrick had brought to their lands, and for what he had quote-unquote stolen from them. Perhaps it was their souls, perhaps it was the countless giants that he took as prisoners of war. Perhaps it was something else entirely. It's essentially whatever's in the briefcase in Pulp Fiction. Anyway, the giants came knocking, and they were not messing around this time. This was the type of conflict where pretty much everybody had to fight. Peasants, criminals, farmers, even beasts. I mean, shit, have you seen the ogres? The King of Want even had literal sentient monsters fighting for him now, which I guess isn't too surprising given who his brother is, but still. And now I guess I'm not sure if they are ogres, they could be trolls, but you get what I mean. Whatever they were, Vendrick didn't stop there. He actually, he had just begun. Due to the nature of the threat, he conscripted or recruited any able-bodied person into his army. That meant criminals, farmers, lowly peasants, merchants, sculptors, that type of thing. They all had to fight, and they were all put into his army in differing roles, like smiths probably served as smiths, but the average bastard wound up a foot soldier or an infantryman. Now, they certainly weren't as well equipped as, say, his royal soldiers were, but there was scores and scores more of them at Vendrick's disposal, and they could be armed, outfitted, and most importantly deployed rather quickly in comparison. The individual soldier was nothing more than a nuisance to most, including us the player and more importantly the giants. But in groups they could work together, and with a little bit of luck they might be capable of bringing down one of these massive foes. I mean, I'd seen crazier things happen before, and I'd imagine that was Vendrick's mindset here. It didn't really matter though, the giants tore through these bastards all the same. Most of them died. These foot soldiers can still be found in a large number, hollowed out beyond reason and undead, usually still hanging around the sites of the great battles that they fought in alongside what's left of the royal army and the occasional ogre. Most notably, this can be viewed at the Forest of Fallen Giants. The place is sort of a metaphor for the war's outcome. Giants become trees and humans become hollows. And both sides have held on to the memories of this horrifically destructive invasion in these new forms that they exist as, even as the world around them slowly crumbled away with the passage of time. But once again, I think I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. The second war with the giants and the resulting plague of the undead had no heroes besides a time-traveling undead, of course, but he's the exception. For example, let's look at the case of Sir Cyan. So this dude was one of Vendrick's finest knights. He was said to be the most loyal guy in the realm, and because of that, he decided to lead the advanced charge when the giants showed up in Dranlaik, only to be slaughtered in a manner that was considered to be most dishonorable. And yeah, it kind of makes you wonder how he went out, but I imagine it was something like that the giants made an example out of his corpse or something, you know? Maybe he got ripped into pieces and the pieces of him were thrown over the over the gate during a siege by the giants. This is one of those situations where we sort of have to fill in the blanks ourselves. Many such cases of that in this series. But moving on, Vendrick tried to honor this valiant but horrifically comical sacrifice by commissioning replicas of Cyan's armor for some of his other trusty loyal knights to wear, only for each of them to subsequently go mad. Some people believe Sir Cyan would possess each of these knights that would wear his replica armor, but no one really knows why. Vendrick honestly just couldn't catch a break. I mean, I like to think that Nishandra may have been behind this trickery of making these knights go mad, but again, who knows? Other notable heroes of the giant invasion were people like Royal Captain Drummond, who met his end alone, surrounded, and to the sound of his men being slaughtered by the giants, although he did get a brief sort of redemption moment where he potentially got to assist a time traveler even the score against the giant lord before he went out Jaime Lannister style and got his armor looted eons later. Anyway, if those two heroic tales were any indication, things were not going so well for Dranlaik in this war. The giants tore through Vendrick's armies at a staggeringly fast rate, but still he held the land secure. But this of course had a major cost. For every giant slain, at least a few dozen soldiers died, and the manpower cost of repelling this ongoing invasion led to Vendrick having to hire mercenaries from neighboring kingdoms. He invited all different kinds to his cause with the promises of wealth and glory, and we can go over the laundry list of hirees that he had. Famously, he called in the elite Ferosan Lion Knights that served a god of war, and they had unfortunately become nomadic after their own kingdom had sort of collapsed. But it wasn't just the Lion Knights, he also hired individual mercenaries from Ferosa like Vengarl, the Amazon Prime's Reacher-sized warrior who wore a wolf head as a helmet. Well, a wolf head themed helmet, I mean. You might know him from speaking to his head in the Shaded Woods. Just an all-around cool, introspective character. But he wasn't always that way. He used to be a bit of a wild card. Just read the description of his weapon. But Vendrick didn't stop there. He hired foreigners from distant lands like the Mad Warrior, of which he had at least one serving him, presumably. The Mad Warriors were a group of Eastern swordsmen who were seemingly disciples of the great Sir Alan based on how they defend his enshrined armor in the ruins of Broom Tower. Obviously, they look really cool. They've got a whole armor set that seems to be inspired by the Predator. And he also hired other smaller groups of foreign mercenaries for, more specialized purposes like the Mira Shadow Knights. Ninjas, essentially, like the Foot Clan from Ninja Turtles. They were known as the Shadow Knights of Mira, and like many of their fellow Mira countrymen, they made their bread by plying their trades as hired blades. However, the type of work that they were typically hired to do was usually much darker than that of the average sellswords. But it's what they were good at, and I'd assume it's the exact reason that Vendrick hired them. Although it is worth noting that the ones in Dranlag had left their order to become sellswords, which, implied that they had less morals. Basically, they didn't mind even the darkest of assignments. And that's essentially exactly why they were given this job. These shadowy fellows were hired for the express purpose of quietly eliminating those who were stricken with the curse of the undead. And they were pretty good at it until they themselves hollowed out too. In some cases, Vendrick imported entire armies of soldiers for hire, like the hilariously quick on their feet Falconers of Volgan. The funniest thing about these guys is that by the events of Dark Souls 3, they're essentially remembered as the sellsword's golden standard. So maybe, just maybe, that way that they run is every bit as efficient as it is hilarious. Works for me. I mean, these guys are described as badass, but then when we see them, they're so goofy to watch move around. Anyways, though, Vendrick didn't stop at just calling in warriors to his cause because he knew that that wasn't going to be enough. He also hired a number of desert pyromancers of Jugo who had seemingly settled in the Harvest Valley. And this was of course done to even the odds against the giants, who had their own primitive form of magic casters. And as the war progressed on, Vendrick would seek out much more unconventional means to bolster his numbers. Due to his obvious desperate need for soldiers to turn the tide of this invasion, Vendrick even came to rely on some of the more monstrous creations of his brother Aldea. Now yes, Vendrick and his brother had their differences at this point, but Aldea likely knew his brother had nowhere else to turn, and this was, of course, before Vendrick imprisoned Aldea inside his keep. This is when they were still on speaking terms. So Aldea helped out in his own way, of course, by using an ancient, long-forgotten dark ritual from either the Gurm or from Pharaoh himself to turn some unfortunate humans into these hulking beastmen known as the Primal Knights. He essentially brought an old race of monstrous abomination back into existence, but with a shinier coat of paint. And hilariously enough, this was all so that they could serve as glorified sentries at Dranlag Palace in case the giants ever made it that far. And the Primal Knights, they were close in size and they wielded actual giant weapons. Based on their size and skill, they probably did give the giants a run for their money, but there probably just wasn't enough of them. They were, of course, highly effective warriors, and they're described as inhuman and are capable of wearing this heavy armor that they're covered in with ease as if it were silk or papyrus. And not to mention they swing these giant massive halberds that probably weigh as much as a goddamn car, and they're swinging them around like twigs, but not like a twig in real life, like a Dark Souls 2 twig, which is of course swung in slow motion. But it's fast for in-game and for how heavy it is. The biggest drawback to the Primal Knights was that unfortunately, due to their human nature, they're highly susceptible to the undead curse. So that, just so you know, even turning a human into a monstrous abomination like a Primal Knight did not spare them from the curse. Otherwise, Vendrick and Aldea probably just would have done that to themselves. Now, I know I'm getting kind of off topic here, but some of the originals can be found in the Door of Pharos, the rusty ones. And they kind of remind me of like a Dark Souls version of the interference units from Made in Abyss. They're these hulking armored warrior guys who were made by a fallen civilization that still exist in these, underground sections of a forgotten part of the map. I don't know, back on topic. I do like to imagine, though, that the Doors of Pharos is likely where Aldea got the idea to make newer, shinier Primal Knights that would be loyal to Vendrick, so, they could basically serve as the perfect castle guards. But these guys weren't the only thing that Aldea had given Vendrick to help him during his time of need. Vendrick used corrosive ants that Aldea had brought over from Jugo to produce a caustic liquid that he then filled the castle moat with in the event that they were overrun by the giants. And this is interesting to me because the stuff, the acid stuff specifically, affects only inorganic material. And this kind of confused me at first, but then I started thinking, wait, well, the giants are made of stone, so perhaps that was the thought process here. Maybe they thought, well, they're stone men, so maybe this material will eat away at them. Could make sense. But anyway, even in his darkest hour, Vendrick had no use for faith or miracles, but he was interested in the occasional dark art, or at the very least, golem magic from a past civilization. This is what he seems to have done with the old knights of Hyde's Tower, because, he stationed several at his own castle, and at least one down in the a manus shrine to cover his escape alongside the Archdrake sect. Perhaps these corroded knights are originally of Lindelt like the Archdrake sect, but who knows? I mean, at the end of the day, it was just more meat for Vendrick's army. That's how he looked at it. He didn't care if they came from a land that had a religion he didn't agree with. But that wasn't the only old lost art that he was interested in. For example, Vendrick must have also studied the work of Egil, the mysterious bull-headed arcane craftsman of the Old Iron King, because he used the knowledge and research of the Old Iron Kingdom to recreate some of their ironclad turtle golems that, according to some sources, would just one day show up and join the front lines alongside Vendrick's royal soldiers and swordsmen. Now, even with all this manpower he was bringing over, he understood that he was also just increasing his future hollow problem. Bringing more people here to live and die and hollow out meant more hollows for him to have to deal with. And this invasion as a whole only expedited the onset of the undead plague, which up until this point Vendrick had dealt with by hiring a group of Vikings to round the undead up and ship them to the Lost Bastille. Now, the Vikings in charge of this job were a unique bunch. They were referred to as the Varangians, and they were said to be a seafaring people with a legendary tendency towards piracy. They were named after the Byzantine Empire's All-Norseman Guard from real life, and they certainly looked the part in the game. These dudes made their home in the northern seas in between the continent that Dranlaic was on and the continent of giants. These were the only pirates brave enough to do so. They were said to be extremely deadly and posed a significant threat to the kingdoms that would sprout up in the south, and either Vendrick or a previous king, maybe the king of Olafis, maybe the king of Ven, or the Old Iron King, it doesn't really matter which one of the kings it was, but a king led a campaign against these guys, and instead of imprisoning them or executing them, he put them to work at No Man's Wharf. The job they assigned was simple and it fit their skill sets. It basically involved rounding up the undead and ferrying them to another location, the Lost Bastille. It's safe to assume that Vendrick likely just kept them in business after he conquered the area that the wharf was a part of, and they were effective enough and it got some of the undead out of sight, so Vendrick probably couldn't complain until all of them also hollowed out. I mean, that was the story of Vendrick's life. Everybody's going hollow eventually. Anyway, though, back on topic, these Vikings would ship the undead out to a place called the Lost Bastille, an ancient fort/prison, which itself is a relic of a previous kingdom that had seemingly been reused each age for this same singular purpose of housing the undead. It was currently garrisoned by a troop of Vendrick's royal swordsmen and some of those Vikings, and also a number of ruin golems that were created in the image of a group of knights that had set out to find the dark soul of man in that city they were promised by the gods, only to never return. Eventually we would learn that the ruin knights did find the city, but let's just say that the city wanted to keep them. Anyway, these golems and the Bastille were presumably built by some previous king. Perhaps it's the same king that broke the Varangians, but this place could even predate that. Oh, and I almost forgot, speaking of weird golems, the lower decks of the ships that brought the hollows to the Bastille were often secured by flexile sentries, which were these really interesting golems presumably created by this same mysterious king who we really can't figure out the identity of, but ultimately doesn't matter. They seem to be employed by Vendrick, but he doesn't ever seem to have used them in actual warfare and only just keeps them as the jailers of the hollows. Maybe they're hard to control, or they don't, follow orders that well, or maybe they just can't fight alongside normal people. That's why ninjas have to assist them in their boss fight, because, the ninjas are quiet and silent and they don't even know they're there. But anyway, I'm getting off topic. Even with all of these built-in problem solvers, still the issue of the undead persisted and even grew, which was in no small part due to Vendrick's reckless importing of foreign troops that would inevitably succumb to the curse. So, because of the sheer volume of hollows now in Dranlaic, Vendrick allowed the lords under him to organize and carry out undead hunts in their lands to cull the hollow population, and as the war with the giants went on, the number of undead increased to an unmanageable level, so the frequency of these hunts only increased. That is, until the hunters themselves also hollowed out. So anyway, as you probably could have guessed, after the onslaught of giants finally ended, the country of Dranlake was in ruins. Well, most of it, that is. Dranlake Castle, on the other hand, was still in pretty good condition. The still breathing remains of the Giant Lord were buried deep underneath what would become known as the Forest of Fallen Giants. By this point, things weren't looking too good for Vendrick's kingdom. I mean, half of it was in ruins, and a good portion of the population was now hollow. Yeah, the giants were gone, but they certainly sped up the undead curse problem he had. And this is essentially the part in the story where the country started to look like the Dranlake that we know and experience in the game of Dark Souls 2. And, less like the glorious kingdom it's described as in passing. The hired and built-in means to deal with the undead problem gradually became obsolete as the ones in charge of them slowly hollowed out themselves, as we've talked about. The other giant corpses grew into trees that still contained the vivid memories of their war with the humans. And these memories could of course be accessed if one possessed the Ashen Mist Heart. And at this point, a very large portion of Dranlake was hollows, as I probably already said. Now, it was around this time that Vendrick began to notice something off or peculiar about his wife Nashandra. Perhaps he'd always known deep down and just chose to ignore it. Maybe her darkness was just more apparent to him now. It's sort of tough to say. Maybe it was just something he could no longer deny. For whatever reason, maybe after taking a look around at his fallen kingdom, it all finally became clear to Vendrick what she was. A literal piece of darkness. And what had Vendrick done? He had welcomed her into his fold with open arms and let her whisper in his ear and convince him to invade the giants. He built a goddamn palace for her. A palace that survived the war with the giants unscathed. He truly was the king who beckoned the dark. He welcomed it to his side willingly. He used it to its advantage just as it used him, kinda, or maybe less so than it used him, but you get what I mean. And at this point, Vendrick felt completely powerless. It was too late to do anything, it truly was. She had already essentially won. As the darkness grew, so did her power. It was at that point where even her likeness in portrait could curse someone. So Vendrick did the only thing he could. He ran. He took his most loyal of remaining knights, Velstadt the Horse Lord, and fled into the undead crypt, while leaving a series of intricate traps in his wake in case Nashandra gave any thought towards pursuing him. He also stationed a number of statue golems who I think are criminally underused in this game, and a powerful looking glass knight at the crypt's entrance to further deter visitors. So while Vendrick was on his way to the undead crypt, he had to pass through the infamous Shrine of Amana, which was filled with the Milfanito and cursed dog lizards that luckily would fall asleep to the sound of the singing Milfanito. These enchanting maidens were created by the very first of the dead, the Gravelord Nito, for the express purpose of soothing and singing to the dead cursed ones so that they don't get violent. Sounds kind of nice. Vendrick probably hoped that this would at the very least slow Nashandra or her minions down. And it does appear that the Milfanito have been effective at keeping out Nashandra, or at the very least to the point where she's now pissed off because recently she's been attempting to bypass it by abducting one of the Milfanito and imprisoning them inside Dranlake Castle. It's actually kind of a trip. It's hidden in this cage that's very reminiscent. It just feels like very old school fantasy video game, or even like Legend of Zelda. But the interesting thing here is that it has the classic Dark Souls spin, and that the lock is both part lock and part hollow. It's known as the embedded, and you need a very special key to open them up. The absence of this one singular Milfanito led to the monsters of the shrine waking up and the whole area becoming a lot more dangerous for travelers. Nashandra presumably did this to prevent undead seeking a cure for the curse from reaching and convening with the exiled King Vendrick. I mean, that's what it seems like at least, although it's anyone's guess. Now, it's been tossed around that Vendrick may have actually been involved in the kidnapping and subsequent imprisoning of this Milfanito through the use of this embedded in order for him or Aldia to learn and study the unique nature of the Milfanito. And it is possible since it's exactly the type of thing Aldia does, but I still lean more towards it being Nashandra simply because of the Milfanito's effect on those bound by dark and the lack of evidence connecting it to Vendrick or Aldea, but I am open to either interpretation. And as for the embedded, his origin is just as wacky as he looks. Before he came to be what he is now, this hollow was just some really twisted, random, lustful dude who realized that he would never be able to resist the temptation of flesh, so he chained himself to a cage containing a hot chick, awaiting the day someone finally kills him by driving a key into his face. Again though, I think Nishandra did all of this to understand how the Milfanito work and to bypass one of Vendrick's security measures. It also had the effect of making the shrine dangerous for anyone following Aldea's guidance to succeed his brother. The Milfanito sing and put cursed ones to sleep, so Nishandra imprisoned one of them to make those cursed abyssal-looking monsters wake up and, of course, get violent. So now the whole area then becomes a mix of Vendrick's hollowed-out minions and the awakened creatures of darkness that lurk beneath the water. Now the key to the embedded was found inside the gut of the Demon of Song, a foreskin frog monster, if you will. Now how the key got there is another story, and it's one that does not have a clear answer and that would take another 5 minutes for me to speculate on. The Shrine of Amana itself was originally built to seal in the Demon of Song after it developed a taste for human flesh, but after the priests in charge with keeping it sealed away all hollowed out, it managed to get out, unsurprisingly, and it began trapping and eating the warriors that took the king's path to pursue the runaway monarch, Vendrick. Now, I imagine two kinds of people made this journey, those serving Nishandra either knowingly or unknowingly, and those seeking a cure for their curse. People who are walking the same road as the player, individuals like Lucatil or Benhart. If there's one thing they all had in common, they were all seeking Vendrick, whether they knew it or not. I mean, he's the guy who came closest to curing the curse after all. This whole part could also be viewed as Aldea and Nishandra playing a game of chess against one another using the undead that come to Dranlaic as game pieces. Nishandra trying to keep people away from Vendrick, or at least sending them to their death to go find him. And Aldea, carefully guiding an undead that was worthy enough to Vendrick and to, fully understand the circumstances that led to his current state of existence. Aldea makes Dranlaic known as a place to find a cure so that undead come from all over to seek the throne, and Nishandra makes that road to the castle and also Vendrick as treacherous as she can, while also attempting to block their progress with any means she has left at her disposal. That cursed life-size portrait of Nishandra could also be a hint from either Aldea or Vendrick to possibly warn prospective undead champions of her true nature, considering by the time they see that portrait, they're literally right about to meet Nishandra. That should be, they should suspect something's up, or at the very least to not trust her completely. And of course, it's also entirely possible that neither of them cursed it, and the image giving off curse is just showing how powerful Nishandra currently is, and that your power is of a dark nature. Which would make sense since the fire's fading, to the point of where it's almost gone. And because of that, the darkness in her is so intense that even her image on a painting can curse people. I mean, it makes sense to me, but I'm getting a little off subject here, so let's move on. Anyways, Vendrick proceeded from the Shrine of Amana into the massive undead crypt proper with his small entourage, where he crossed paths with the Finito Grave Warden leader and all-around blue guy, Agdane, who allowed Vendrick asylum deep within the massive mausoleum, and so he found himself a nice large room and stationed Velstadt outside the room and basically sat there. Velstadt didn't really mind. He got a room just in front of Vendrick's room for him to slowly go mad in. And look, the guy's got discipline. I wouldn't be able to tell he was mad until I took a look at his soul. Seriously, for some reason, the Horse Lord's soul is covered in darkness, which is interesting when you consider some of his history. He's known for being the loyal knight out of a duo of Vendrick's more famous guys. See, after Cyan, who we talked about earlier, got the Nanami treatment, there were two big dogs left in Vendrick's crew, and that was Velstadt and Raim. See, Velstadt was into horses, and Raim was into crows and wearing all black. He was sort of like the like the goth or emo kid. He probably brooded around a lot. And Velstadt, of course, was the more traditional knight. And I guess it's no surprise that these two differing personalities would clash, because Velstadt did indeed quarrel with his raven-themed contemporary, culminating in like a duel between the two of them that Velstadt won, but he didn't kill Rhaime. Rhaime then just took off and left, wound up in Broome, and sort of got uplifted or given new purpose in life by Nadalia, another shard of darkness and technically Nishandra's sister. Velstadt's own soul is now covered in darkness, and it leads me to believe that they shared a similar fate. I mean, they both guard the monarch that gave them a reason to live, even as they hollowed out. And, because Nadalia, she's sort of just withered away into a husk because she gave her life energy to the land of Broome Tower. It's a whole other thing that maybe I'll do a video on the Shard Sisters to cover, but moving on. The Horseman wasn't the only one that Vendrick brought in his little crew that he dove into the crypt with. He also brought a dragon rider, one of the famous elite knights of Dranlek, and a few Cyan knights, and he stationed them right outside where he stationed Velstadt. He then presumably pulled out his own soul and sent one of his other dragon riders to go guard it back at the Shrine of Amana, his royal kingly soul, and it was specifically placed behind a door that could only be accessed by humans and not hollows. Now, I think it's safe to say that at this point, if Vendrick was going to hollow out, he probably did shortly after removing his own soul, but it probably did take quite a while with him waiting in that room guarded by Velstadt for him to truly hollow out into the husk of a man that we see when we encounter him in the present day compared to what we see in the memory. And who's to say if he sent the dragon rider with his soul to go place it there, or if he pulled his own soul out while he was passing through the Shrine of Amana and left it behind that door and left one of his dragon riders behind to guard it. Either scenario is likely. I think that second one might be a little more so, but that one of course is up to you guys. And not to go on another tangent, but speaking of the dragon riders, these guys really fell from grace. I mean, the original ones helped Vendrick found the kingdom of Dranlek, and the new recruits, they were subject to an insane training program if they wanted to ride with the big dogs, and unfortunately for them, it usually just resulted in said recruit being eaten by the wyvern mount that they were trying to tame, but that's only if they made it that far. There's a good chance that they couldn't survive the intense training that led up to the taming of a dragon. It's a whole thing. Wyvern. Anyway, by this point in the story, there was probably only a handful of them left, and they'd lost their mounts because of Vendrick's feud with Aldia. When Vendrick sealed off Aldia's keep from the rest of the world, he also sealed off access to the Dragon Area, which was, only reachable via an elevator behind Aldia's house. Now the remaining few are, in forgotten parts of the world, like the one in Hyde's Tower of Flame, or guarding the literal Shard of Darkness Nishandra at the Castle of Dranlek, or as in the case of these last two, just guarding the king's final resting place and probably slowly hollowing out as well. So anyways, here in this dark, forgotten, buried away place, Vendrick stayed until, one day an undead was guided here by Aldia's muse, the Emerald Herald, to gather the four souls, and then Aldia then led them to witness his brother's current state. Aldia wanted his prospective champion to walk the same steps that his brother Vendrick did. He also wanted this bearer of the curse to see what became of his brother, the one king who came closest to becoming a true monarch. See, Vendrick had never truly linked the fire, or in his case, sat the throne, partly because he didn't have the giant's kinship, but the main reason for this, I think, is simple, because of Nishandra, and in more ways than one. Presumably, if he were to link the flame, then Nishandra's power and influence would likely wane and possibly even fade. Whether Vendrick knew this to be precise is a mystery, and at this point we'd only be speculating as to why he didn't link the fire. And I think that's got to be the big one. I mean, he does say himself that he did genuinely care for Nishandra, but there could be other reasons as well. Because like I said, we don't even know if he knew that if he linked the fire, then her power would fade, because presumably he only found out that she was a Shard of Darkness late in their time together. He says he built the kingdom to be closer to fire, which, yeah, it could explain why the first flame is technically very far beneath his grand castle. But none of that really explains why he never sat the throne. I mean, like I said, it could be that he lacked the proper items, like the giant's kinship and the ashen mist heart to get the kinship, but I don't think those were required for Vendrick to sit the throne. Yeah, they're required for us, but that's a whole other story. We're tackling this like 1,000 years later. Well, maybe not 1,000, but you get what I mean. Many years later, we're picking up where he left off. Plus, it's also worth mentioning that his own soul's description suggests that he was a lacking vessel for the throne. So it could just be as simple as that he just couldn't sit the throne. He couldn't link the flame. The crushing revelation, that he didn't have the makings of a varsity athlete. Vendrick was probably one of the strongest humans to ever walk the earth, but it didn't matter. There was something fundamentally about his very being that he lacked that kept him from becoming a true monarch. Now, whether or not Vendrick knew he was incapable of sitting the throne is a whole other story, and that's one I don't really have an answer for, but I did just want to mention this. Although not for nothing, if he did actually just try to link the fire or sit the throne, then there's a chance we could have seen him again in Dark Souls 3, or maybe even played as him, because there's a chance he would have became Unkindled Ash. That's all our player character is in Dark Souls 3 anyway. It was just somebody who attempted to link the flame, but just wasn't strong enough, or, lacked the required souls to succeed, and instead just got fully burned up in the process. But yeah, what could have been had he just attempted to link the fire. But anyway, where was I? Nashandra and Vendrick. Darkness gathers power as the fire fades, and as the fire fades, the curse of the undead rises. And conversely, when the fire is linked, the darkness will be at its very weakest, and this was something that essentially Nashandra did not want. Which I think could mean that maybe she stopped Vendrick from sitting the throne. She whispered in his ear and just did all these things that kept him from actually linking the fire so she could remain in power, which probably started looking pretty suspicious to Vendrick, and maybe ultimately was what led to him discovering her true nature. And I think that tracks. She could have kept Vendrick from linking the fire because it would have weaken her. So it's safe to assume that she's got no love or use for the undead champions like us, since we sort of represent a wrench being thrown into her works on behalf of Aldia, who is sort of her last adversary. He's like the last man standing who's in some sort of opposition to her. Nashandra would probably prefer it if either us or Vendrick was dead, so, she does the only thing that makes sense. When we finally reach her at the palace, she tells us to seek Vendrick out because she knows how dangerous the path would likely be, and it would probably sort us out, or maybe Vendrick himself would, or, any of the above. Vendrick had personally made the path to where he was at one of the most immensely treacherous roads imaginable, and it really only got worse with the passage of time. And if somehow we were able to survive this road and our meeting with Vendrick, and return to the palace after learning Nashandra's true nature, we only find that she's gone. She had to edit her plan accordingly, set up a confrontation with us in the throne room, the true throne room, after we kill off her two possessed henchmen, the throne watcher and defender. That's of course when Nashandra has her big, WWE style entrance, where the mask fully drops and she violently tries to prevent us from taking the throne. But she's a story for another day. Aldia, on the other hand, guided us to Vendrick, the undead champion, the potential successor to his brother, to see what had become of Vendrick, and so that the successor could make their own choice on what to do when they finally got to the throne. Anyway, though, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. Back to Vendrick. So, as he awaited eternity in that room, his body slowly withered and hollowed out. Because, after a while, it happens to us all. Even then, though, he was an immensely powerful hollow. I mean, probably one of the most durable of in all Dark Souls history. Seriously, he's ridiculously tough to the point where it takes possessing several giant souls to get through his insane defenses to even, do a reasonable amount of damage to him without having to just, it becomes like using the broken sword in Dark Souls 1 through the entire game. It's doable, but it's just very tedious. And it's also interesting to note that he had such a intense impact on the giants that their hatred for him, it's embedded in their very souls. That's a pretty impressive feat for a man to, make this race of giants hate you that much because of the conquest and the ruin that you brought them. And even when fighting him with all 5 giant souls in your inventory, he still hits like a truck, so, be careful. I think it's safe to say that he's genuinely one of the strongest hollows to ever walk the earth. And walk he did, forever in fact, and in circles, which sort of represents the cycle that he was trapped in, if I wanted to get highbrow in my analysis. Anyway, his consciousness, on the other hand, remained in a memory from before he hollowed out alone in the dark, and this was accessed by the very own bearer of the curse, and the two of them had a pretty nice chat. With, Vendrick doing most of the talking. He basically explained the function of the mysterious crowns of the other almost monarchs, and his own failings and laments regarding Nishandra and Dranlaic. He basically suggests to his potential successor to seek out the crowns of these other kings for answers like he had tried to do, but, he became overwhelmed with his own kingdom before he could. We also see from his conversation that he did indeed care for Nishandra and also understood what she was. This is, I think, a nice contrast to how Nishandra spoke of him. I mean, it was sort of disparagingly, with her saying that he was less of a king than you might imagine, and even outwardly suggesting that we kill him, which, look, it might be spot on, but it's still a pretty messed up contrast. Anyway, Vendrick guides the player to succeed where he failed, and if they do manage to gather these 3 mysterious crowns, Vendrick's memory helps them forge the one true crown that can bypass the undead curse. And it's not the most effective circumvention of the curse, but it does work for one person. He also basically tells the player that it's up to them to usher in what comes next, whether it's light, dark, or something else entirely. Vendrick tried his hardest and ultimately failed. He didn't realize until it was too late that his wife's true nature was rather sinister. And, she may have always been manipulating so that she could be the Queen of Darkness. That's definitely a possibility. But his last act was one of defiance against the fate he had unknowingly condemned himself to. And after his self-imposed exile, the world largely continued to go on and crumble, indifferent towards Vendrick's laments. And unlike Gwyn, Vendrick was just a man, a human. He got caught in the never-ending cycle of light and dark being in conflict with one another. Vendrick's story, it's a tragedy, and Gwyn's is like almost a comedy of a guy who was unwilling to let his time in power end, and, look how it ended up. It's like one of those comedies about the Greek gods. Yeah, the world of Dark Souls still suffered for it, but it can still be viewed as darkly comedic, at least by some. Anyway, back to the man of the hour. As Vendrick slowly hollowed out in that dark room, Nishandra quietly ruled over the rubble of what was left of Dranlaic, while Aldea schemed to find a true monarch in the form of a hollow who could succeed his brother. According to Aldea's muse, Shanalot, Nishandra covets the power of the First Flame and the Great Soul. Her goal is presumably to fully usurp the flame itself and instill a true age of darkness. That seems to be the idea, at least. Now, this great soul she was seeking probably just refers to the powerful soul that Vendrick had amassed fighting his many conquests and used to avoid the undead curse for so long, the massive kingly soul. And what a mighty soul it was. I mean, you saw it took the combined power of, 5 giant souls just to even the playing field with him. Vendrick's got a mighty soul, and that's presumably also why he fled the castle and hid away from her in a dark crypt while seeking asylum from the grave wardens, because if he stayed at Dranlaic Castle, Nishandra basically had all the pieces she needed to enact her treacherous plan. I think it's possible that Vendrick may have thought that she could use his soul to use the throne to take over and get that Age of Darkness going proper. So it looks like Vendrick had a good reason to flee and install all those obstacles to slow her down or her henchmen. I mean, this even extended to having Velstadt kill anyone who tried to bring Vendrick back to the Queen.
Watch this. Ooh. Sleep, motherfucker!
And so again, this makes sense. He just wanted to be alone and enjoy the silence while he awaited eternity. At some point during this long, deep reflection, he managed to remove his own soul from his body and stash it away behind an enchanted door that was only accessible to a human and not a hollow. This was his final measure against Nishandra, since even if she did manage to succeed in killing him, or at least having him killed, she wouldn't have his soul, and that's what she really needed anyway, so in the end, Vendrick would have won unless she figured out how to use the some poor bastard that happened to be human to open up the door for her. As for Vendrick, he would slip off into hollowing when he finally lost his purpose in life, when he finally gave up. He began doubting his apparent decision to not sit the throne or link the flame. Basically, the guy spent his final days coming to terms with the foolishness of mankind as a whole, that they would cast aside the fire, the only warmth they've ever known, only to face greater hardship in the unknown of the darkness. The true unknown, the antithesis of light. As for Vendrick, for his worth, he really wanted to just find a way around linking the fire to gain the strength that the gods had denied him, but, in that was his big issue. That's the whole reason he wanted to cure the undead curse without sitting the throne. In a way, Vendrick would have preferred to have had his cake and eat it too, but it just wasn't in the cards for him. I think he basically just wants to help the player succeed where he failed, to gather those crones and to make that spiffy new one, put it on, and make a decision. Whether they link the flame or abandon the throne to see whatever comes next, it doesn't really matter. At least they'll have more success than he had. The undead curse shows man for what they truly are. And Vendrick basically became defeated when he could only come up with a temporary solution in the form of those crowns from the DLCs. It could keep him from hollowing out and keep the strength that he had gained, sure, but the world would still hollow out around him and he would eventually be alone or just with Nishandra, a fate he presumably feared at this point. And this is what led to him basically just giving up while he was alone in that room doing all that reflecting. He concluded that he was foolish all this time for not sitting the throne. He thought that denying the fire or rekindling would give some sort of a transcendence to him and maybe all of mankind. Maybe it would give them their true power back, whatever that mysterious thing was, although little did Vendrick know their true power was as hollows. So instead of any type of transcendence that he hoped for, all he got was more struggles and confusion. And perhaps this revelation was only possible because he was finally far enough away from Nishandra. Maybe her presence clouded his thoughts. Although personally I think that this final doubt of his is essentially the first sign of his eventual hollowing out. It's the baby steps to being the full-blown massive hollow that we see him as when we finally meet face to face. That's another thing. His disappearance is also largely a mystery to the rest of the kingdom. I mean, Agdane does say that various soldiers went to try and come pick up the king from down in the undead crypt, but every single time Velstadt killed him. The king's men that came looking for Vendrick. The ghost of Chancellor Veliger says that Vendrick had been taken by the queen, and that can mean a million things, but to me that only just means that Vendrick left because of Nishandra. Although the rumors circling the kingdom before it finally collapsed could have indicated that people really thought that Nishandra did something to him, that she did away with him or imprisoned him somewhere. I mean, it makes sense. It wouldn't be the first time a population of a kingdom had distrust for a foreign bride of their beloved king. But none of that really mattered because all the people spreading those rumors eventually hollowed out too. And soon there really wasn't much left of Vendrick outside of a difficult-to-access memory. Well, and his lovely kingdom of Dranlaich, of course, which was, it held up longer than him. And Dranlaich Castle stood tall against the passage of time. I mean, you can see the tower of which from most of the other regions of the continent. The same, however, could not be said for its inhabitants or its garrison. Most of those poor bastards turn to stone and only really wake up when an unfortunate intruder happens to step through the halls of the castle. Although them blending in with the statues could just be some form of camouflage as far as I know. They're certainly different than the statues you find in Aldia's Keep, for example, since you need a fragrant branch to wake those ones up, and these ones just wake up on their own. I'm actually really thinking that they may just be camouflage to blend in with actual statues because, some of them don't wake up, and some of them may have never been real soldiers in the first place, but we don't really know that. This is just something I thought worth mentioning. But anyway. The kingdom would become a place where people from all over the world would search for a cure for their hollowing affliction. This would eventually lead to Vendrick's brother finally finding the champion he'd always been searching for, and they would succeed where Vendrick failed. What followed isn't exactly clear. We don't know what path the champion chose to go down, light, dark, something else entirely. But the kingdom, after the events of the game, sort of just fades into obscurity in the greater scheme of things in terms of the historical lore of the Dark Souls universe. I mean, it's to the point where its full name isn't even remembered, while contemporary kingdoms like Mira and Feroce's names are, but remnants and even descendants of the fallen land of Dranlaich stood the test of time and made it to potentially the end of all cycles in Dark Souls 3. It's alright though, guys, we're almost at the end of this thing. Just bear with me. I did not think it was going to be this long. So, many cycles later in Dark Souls 3, Vendrick is remembered as the old king of want who beckoned dark, and his shield is actually still around. The land of Dranlake he built is referred to a lost land known for the legend of linking the fire, which I guess makes sense since everything was actually unknowingly centered around that with the taking of the throne and all that good stuff. Seems like the act of taking a throne being synonymous with linking the fire is also something that was kept from Vendrick's time. Although Vendrick's actual name is forgotten from history, there are several things from his rule that linger on in this world. Most notably, and in my opinion most curiously, is a portrait of Nashandra. Could even be a piece from one of the ones that hung in Dranlake Castle back in Dark Souls 2, even though, it would be just a portion of it. And that's found in a manor in the city of Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. And with the presence of the Drang Knights in the same city, it's safe to assume that Nashandra's true nature was something that never came to the light of the outer world, or that the supposed ruler of Irithyll has some sort of reverence for a shard of manus or darkness in general. Now, these Drang Knights are actually individuals who are descendants of the land of Dranlake, but as you can see, the full name of their home kingdom has been lost to the ages. But the unique power-stancing fighting style is something that has been carried on. Now, when it comes to Vendrick, there were certain individuals that followed in his footsteps, like High Lord Wolnir, who had conquered the lands of several kingdoms and formed Karthus after grounding their crowns into dust and making himself a true crown from the remains. I mean, it sounds familiar enough to me. I wouldn't even be surprised if Wolnir didn't have a chat with Vendrick's memory. But it's most likely he's just following in his footsteps symbolically. Wolnir was also a bit like Gwyn, though, in that he feared the dark, and perhaps it was because of how it brought about the end of the previous conqueror kings throughout history. Pretty reasonable fear, if you ask me. I mean, if you were looking at the history books and saw that darkness brought down all these different kingdoms and also brought down even the kingdom of the gods eventually, then yeah, I'd be pretty concerned. But Wolnir wasn't the only one who followed in Vendrick's footsteps. For example, there was Yorm, who ironically was a giant, sort of like an inversion of the events of Dark Souls 2 almost. But he had to sit a throne in order to link a flame, much like Vendrick, and maybe that's just the way things were after Dark Souls 2. I mean, Vendrick does say if you want to link the fire, you have to first sit the throne. Maybe every potential Lord of Cinder or potential monarch has their own throne that they then use when they're worthy enough to access the flame to then link it, and only some kings ever make it to that step, and even fewer are able to use their throne to link the flame. It's definitely something worth thinking about. Now, Yorm's problems, besides his people hating him, came after his linking of the fire. It seems much like Vendrick, his rule was meddled with by forces of the dark. So when Yorm linked the flame, something went horribly wrong, and it basically incinerated everybody in the profane capital except for the handmaids and, the culprits themselves, who instead were mutated into these really bizarre monstrosities of sin creatures. It's a whole thing. Although I like to think that these women that were responsible for the destruction of the profane capital were in some way similar to Nashandra in that they were possibly children of the Abyss, or at the very least that they meddled with the flame. Maybe they managed to corrupt the first flame of Yorm's cycle, and that's why when he linked it, it essentially went berserk, and essentially a fire fell down upon the profane capital and burned everybody. And whether or not these women were shards of the Abyss or children of darkness or not doesn't really matter. I mean, it's mentioned in game that they are responsible for the bizarre fate that befell the profane capital. And to me, that's pretty similar to some of the other shards' actions with the kings of fallen kingdoms, so it's similar enough to mention. I mean, honestly, stuff like that probably deserves its own video. The Children of the Abyss and their consequences, but, I've kind of covered them in a few videos now, and at this point, it'd probably be just, it would just feel like a rehash, but who knows? Let me know in the comments if you want to see a video on the Shards of Manus. I know, many such cases of this. But moving on. There are several things from Vendrick's age that managed to make it to the end, and sadly Vendrick's name ultimately was not one of them. His shield, on the other hand, was, and curiously enough, it's found in the Smoldering Lake section of Dark Souls 3, and there's some possible theories as to why it's here, but nothing concrete. Perhaps this was the work of a grave robber from the Carthus catacombs, and Vendrick's shield just happened to be one of the treasures that this poor bastard tried to escape with, only to obviously meet his end here at what experts refer to as the sauna version of Ash Lake. Now, this wouldn't be the only time that something that was last seen in Drangleic wound up in Carthus, which only really highlights the many possible connections between the two kingdoms, although given the desert theme, I think it's safe to say that the seat of Wolnir's unified Carthus is probably just what became of the desert kingdom of Jugo. They both are described as vast deserts and are known for their swordsmen and pyromancers, so it just seems kind of likely. But once again, we are getting a little off topic towards the end. Vendrick's even responsible for some of the more bizarre shit that we come across late in the game in Dark Souls 3, like those half-dragon experiments that are reminiscent of the work his brother Aldia had once carried out. And that was under Vendrick's rule, so he is partially responsible for that kind of research, still being around. I know it's not entirely his fault, but, it happened under his watch, or his lack of watch, I guess I should say. Now, we're finally getting towards the end here, but there's one last thing I wanted to go over before we get into the final closing statement, or whatever other YouTubers call it. It mainly just deals with some dialogue from a certain ghost character that we meet called Chancellor Veliger. So when we get to Drangleic Castle, we meet the ghost of Chancellor Veliger, and the good Chancellor claims that Vendrick killed the 4 Great Ones and claimed their souls, which, it seems a bit odd seeing as how we just killed them. And look, sure, I guess it's possible that he killed them, and then when he hollowed out, the Great Souls left him and found purchase elsewhere in the current Great Ones because they were similar enough to the previous owners. It could even maybe explain why the Great Ones dropped those 2 separate souls in New Game Plus or Bonfire Intensity 2 and beyond. They still drop their soul, like for example, Soul of the Rotten, but they now drop an additional soul, in this case the soul of the old dead one. The souls that the Great Ones drop after their rematch are quite literally described as the very same souls that Gwyn and friends found in the Age of Ancients back before their war with the dragons. But more important than all of that, I think it's also possible that Veliger's ghost has warped the memory of events. I mean, he is a ghost after all. He doesn't seem to know the answer to the ultimate question, is it future or is it past? He seems to act like everything's all good up until the end of his dialogue where he kind of snaps out of it and asks who you are. And by all good, I mean he doesn't seem to realize that the kingdom is in shambles and he's acting like Vendrick's still around and in charge. But what I mean to say is, how reliable of a narrator can this guy, this ghost, be when he doesn't even know what year he's in? I just wanted to mention this because that bit from his dialogue always sort of confused me a little bit. But now let's get on to the final word about Vendrick. So at the end of the day, Vendrick was just completely outside his depth with trying to solve his many problems and trying to become a monarch. He was an extremely exceptional individual, perhaps the greatest of the long line of failed kings that came before him. But ultimately, he was just a human attempting to fight the will of the gods. Gods who were long dead and hollowed out themselves for the most part. Which, yeah, there's some irony to it, but it actually made things a lot worse. Well, for people like Vendrick, that is, because there was now no one left to extract vengeance from for this huge affront to humanity. Instead, he was forced to play by their rules and on their clock. I probably already said it, but Vendrick was fighting against the literal way things were, and unsurprisingly was given no mercy in return. The shackles were already on him. He's been described as being cursed by an insatiable thirst for power, so maybe this was always the outcome for him since he couldn't truly link the fire. And whether he was truly cursed or not, his determination is exactly what made him admirable, and it also made his failures so tragic, for lack of a better term. He wasn't Gwyn, he was actually more like the anti-Gwyn. Vendrick was a victim of circumstance. He wasn't the guy who wrote the rules and got scared of the dark. Vendrick was a victim of Gwyn's curse, or actually, more better put, his fear. I mean, the curse only existed because Gwyn was afraid of the dark, and Nishandra only existed because a time traveler had to go back to the past to clean up one of Gwyn's various messes. And what did Vendrick have to do? Well, he had to deal with the long-term consequences of these actions, the destruction of Manus, the undead curse, and he had to do this all without even fully understanding why. Even if it didn't seem like it, he was actually riding uphill his entire existence. Sure, he was addicted to chasing power and fire through any means necessary, and he was even pretty good at it. He had many successes. But the cards were always stacked against him. Every single one of his struggles could be traced back to the scheming Lord of Light, who was really no less than a charlatan. Yeah, he killed some dragons, but he also did a lot of lying and a lot of scheming. And his only goal was to prolong his time on top at the expense of all humanity, every single human individually, since they were all inheritors of the Dark Soul. What's worse is that somehow Gwyn tricked the humans into revering himself and, more importantly, the flame, even though it was that very thing that caused them to hollow. The life it granted them was an illusion, a prop, as Aldia would call it. And many humans were more than happy to go along with it, likely because of a sense of comfort that it brought them and it's all they've ever known. Most people fear the unknown. It's like the saying goes, they'd rather deal with the devil that they know. In this case, that devil was Gwyn, and they didn't really look at him as a devil. They actually looked at him more like a god, part of his ultimate con. And like I just said a little bit ago, the humans on the whole pretty much went along with it. Gwyn had effectively gaslit mankind entirely. He had neutered his greatest threat. In that sense, and in many others, Gwyn is mankind's greatest enemy. He was a god, and Vendrick, while extremely powerful, was only a man. Where Gwyn gasped and recoiled at the darkness and attempted to, eradicate it with light, Vendrick welcomed it, beckoned it, if you will. And as I've said probably an infuriating number of times throughout this video, Vendrick was a king, but he wasn't a true monarch. Like all the unfortunate kings that came before him, he never sat the true throne of the land. He never linked the flame and became an official Lord of Cinder. And he didn't even attempt to sit the throne, otherwise, it would have burnt him away and he could have returned as unkindled ash in Dark Souls 3. It's hardly his fault, though. It's said that linking the flame is extremely difficult, and it takes a very, very capable and powerful individual to do so. Even Gwyn's own reincarnation, the old Iron King, never sat the throne of Want. He just got consumed by evil sentient lava instead before he could, and afterwards his kingdom sunk into that very same lava. Now, we give Vendrick more credit than that because he was, of course, built different than Gwyn's reincarnation. There's a reason he made it further. He found the current form of the kiln in the Throne of Want and chose to build his castle directly above it, presumably to hide it from the world, but he never truly sat it. And of course, that's more than any of the previous kings can say. As for why he never sat it, perhaps this was because of Nishandra, or maybe Vendrick just didn't have the makings of a true monarch and simply couldn't sit it. But that also seems to conflict with the cat god Shalquar saying that the player has a similar scent to Vendrick, which to me indicates that maybe Vendrick could have at least tried to sit the throne if he wanted, but instead chose not to because he knew the strength of man grew as fire faded, but they were stricken with this divine curse in the form of the undead plague. His goal was to find the cure for the curse, not just link the fire and provide a temporary solution. And yeah, his studies with Aldia had showed him that linking the fire was only going to fix it for so long anyway. Eventually the fire would fade again and the curse would crop up and, darkness would gain power. And the individual brothers sought alternative methods to this hollow problem that Gwyn had hung around their necks eons ago. Nishandra was able to exploit this, and how focused Vendrick was on the curse and the invasion, it all made it easier for her to rise to power with her true intentions obscured. Vendrick was really preoccupied with preventing his kingdom from going the way of all the previous ones to see essentially what was right in front of him. The darkness he had willingly let into his bed. But that's the tragedy of King Vendrick, though. He was the king who beckoned the dark, and I think his story is an effective response to what Gwyn did in the first game and how, the world that created turned out. Most people probably linked the fire in the first game and just thought happily ever after. Dark Souls 2, and more importantly Vendrick, shows us just how complicated that happily ever after could be, even if there was already evidence for it in Dark Souls 1. I appreciate how it's all a direct consequence of Vendrick essentially just being afraid of the dark and all of the various things that fear made him do. But at long last, I think that I've finally said all I had to say about Vendrick. But of course, if I missed anything or misinterpreted anything, please let me know in the comments. But as always, I hope you guys found the video to be at the very least somewhat informative, entertaining, or amusing. If you want to see and hear more of this kind of thing, please consider subscribing. We just cracked 35K. It's a pretty big deal to a small channel like mine, and I appreciate the continued support. To put it in terms, I feel more confident in saying, you guys rock. But without further ado, let's have our outro, and then let's get to the final thoughts segment where we talk about what's coming next and a little bit about the video and just really whatever's on my mind. Alright, so that was another almost movie-length video that I did not see coming. I thought it was going to be like a 20-minute talk about Gwen and his whole story, but it became several things at once. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed it, though. It was one of those things that just demanded to be made. Now, on to what's coming next. I have a few things. Like I said, I think I mentioned in one of the previous videos, I had a Death Stranding video coming. That should be coming soon. Of course, there's also the Dark Souls 2 Enemies video that is still coming, and my favorite dungeon from Twilight Princess. A lot of good stuff is on its way, and this video being this large sort of is the reason for my most recent delay, but I can't make any promises, but the next one should come out sooner because they are a lot less lengthy. And I know in these final thoughts I often mention about how I want to cover a TV show or a movie, and there's various TV shows I've talked about here at the in the final thoughts segments of lore videos. It's kind of hard for me to decide on a TV show or movie, though, to make a video about because there are so many of them and I watch so much shit. So I was figuring I would let you guys maybe decide or at least have a say in it. I mean, in the comments, let me know what's a movie or a show you'd like to see me cover in some way, preferably one that you guys have heard me talk about in the past. I've seen a lot of shit, though, so chances are I have seen whatever your suggestion might be, but there's also a lot of shit I haven't seen, so maybe these could turn into some recommendations for me. Who knows? Well, there's also a video on the Lothric royal family that I've been wanting to do for a while. It's only in note form, but it should get made here pretty swiftly. Plenty of good stuff coming, though, but yeah, we're going to try and branch out a little bit more this year while still covering FromSoft stuff. Like maybe I'll cover some Sekiro and Bloodborne this year as well. And unrelated, but there was an episode that I found out was actually not well liked of American Dad that I actually really like, and I wanted to do like a video about that, like why it's not particularly liked versus why I thought it was actually pretty effective. But I wasn't really sure how that would play. I'm not sure how American Dad in general is received by people, but I guess that's just something I'm gonna have to find out for myself by making it at some point. But yeah, I've already been rambling for a movie's worth of time, and I believe that was really all I wanted to get to in the final thoughts, just basically talk about stuff I have planned. But yeah, I appreciate everyone's continued support. You guys make this worth doing it. And if for whatever reason you feel like supporting the channel or helping out, I've opened up YouTube channel memberships because that's a lot easier to deal with than dealing with Patreon. But if you have a Patreon, I have that as well. But enough of the e-begging. I think this is where I'll leave things until you guys hear from me next time. Oh, I almost forgot. Real quick, I wanted to give a very special thank you to Mindspatch and their awesome art. Basically, any of the image drawings you see of the Honored Madman are from them. They're pretty much the only one who's ever really drawn my avatar, me. And once again, I've been blown away by the work of this artist. Somehow they just keep managing to outdo themselves. Look at this birthday artwork that I got. It's combining just about everything I love: chocolate cake, Twin Peaks, and FromSoft, Elden Ring. The Omen Smirk mask. I honestly can't thank Mindspatch enough for this. And I know it's not much, but I just wanted to put it in the video just how grateful I am for the continued support and all the great art. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Alright, though, I believe that was everything I had to get to, so I hope everybody, be well, be safe. You'll be hearing from me again very soon. Be safe out there.
Another good one from Can.